statements issued by hosts, co-hosts, guests, and anyone else appearing on the show do not reflect the stance of the College of New Jersey or the NJDOE OSE. Please use your professional judgment when implementing strategies and resources within your practice.
Switches and apps, little adjustments, big impact. The AT Center presents AT Talks, where every voice has...
Welcome back to AT Talks. This is part 2 of our multi-part deep dive into the Title II compliance and digital accessibility with Janet DeSenzo. In this episode, we move past the introductions into the legal and practical framework. We break down the new ADA updates. We also get practical with Janet's top tips for creating accessible presentations. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss part 3, where we cover accessible document creation, remediating legacy PDFs, and play our game Compliant or Complaint. Title II and the compliance. So let's start with the basics. We hear about this compliance. Why is this important? Why is accessibility important?
I mean, again, for certain people, accessibility is life, right? The difference between existing and really living. Accessibility for some means the ability to travel. It means the ability to read. It's the ability to expand your knowledge. It's so much. And without it, we're just really, it's not just discrimination. I can't even think of the right word right now. But, I think this is really making many schools, institutions, municipalities really think about how they share information now, right? And isn't that the goal? We have to really take a deep dive into how are we building our websites? How are we disseminating information? Are we sending out, hard copy letters? And we're hoping that somebody can scan them and OCR them and have somebody read them out loud. It's just really, I think it's going to be a turning point in the way many businesses, schools, and municipalities function now. I'm hoping that's what it is.
Mm-hmm. So
and
can
just
you...
thinking about,
Yep.
I was just going to say, just thinking about how much more time in our busy lives someone would need to take to be able to do those things, to scan a document in, to OCR it and be able to just understand what it's saying. So really putting yourself in the shoes of somebody you might not think about who needs to access that document.
Right. Well, and with the Title II compliance, it's that there are so many times, and we talked a little bit about a website that parents sometimes use in order to access grades, and I remember I tried it with an individual years ago, and it was not accessible, and so retrofitting is not really the best way to do things anyway, because you have to usually rewrite all the code and fix things and all that kind of stuff. It's that, and I think we've talked about it on this podcast before, building it from the ground up, and it makes it easier for districts or for government entities and all that to kind of think about it before we do anything instead of afterwards. It's a proactive, right? Being proactive instead of reactive, right? So can you break down what the recent rule changes mean for schools?
Yeah. So, there are deadlines, and we have to think about when this all has to be done, right? So when you think about from a school standpoint, if I was a school administrator and I have to think about all of the digital materials that need to be made accessible, we're not just talking about classrooms, right? We're talking about, again, as you said before, the tools that the parents use to get online and get their grades. We're also looking at learning management systems. We're looking at purchased curriculums. And then we're looking at those tools that the curriculum materials that the teachers create and make themselves. So there are deadlines that we have to keep in mind, and they're based on population, municipality populations. So when this first came out, we had a little bit more time. And right now, time's kind of running. So these new changes were enacted in April of 2024. And so now the timeline is based on the population of the schools, the school districts. So if you are talking about really big school districts, like 50,000 people or more that live in the population of that municipality, you don't have a whole lot of time. You've got up until April 24th of this year. That's the deadline. So hopefully you put those teams in place and you've made some progress on looking at your um, digital materials. If you are a school in a municipality that is less than 49,000 people in your population, then you have another year. You have until April 26th of 2027. So you have a little bit more time.
Cool. And can we talk a little bit? So there's these the I've been hearing about poor principles, POUR. We love our acronyms, right, Vanessa? So
Yeah,
can you
that's what we do.
can you explain to us what these poor principles, these four poor principles are?
So there's the WCAG principles are based on four specific areas, and it POUR is the acronym, and the acronym stands for perceivable, meaning that all areas of the site have to be consumable via a variety of senses. So let's just pick one sense. If you are looking at a website and everything is accessible visually, and we removed that sense, is your website still perceivable? So we have to really think about font type and color options and whether or not um, you can make that accessible with auditory tools and screen readers. So that's perceivable. That's the P. The O stands for operable. Content should be available to those using tools other than a typical mouse and keyboard. So think about all the many ways you can access a computer or any type of digital tools. Maybe you have, a braille reader. Maybe you're using an eye gaze system. So there's a lot of ways to access websites outside of just a keyboard and a mouse. So are they operable with those tools? U stands for understandable. Are you providing content in a clear and consistent manner? Can I understand what's being communicated on that page? And finally, R is robust, making sure that your websites can work with all devices. I'm thinking years and years ago, and I'm going to date myself. We only had, computers that we were worried about making sure our websites were easily viewable on. Now, sometimes if you take those old websites and you try to view it, on your browser on your phone, they're just not robust enough.
Mhm.
They're not optimized for phone use. So we have to make sure that those websites work on all devices, all browsers, all type of assistive technology, and that's where the R comes from in poor, robust.
And I really like kind of breaking it down into these principles, not only because, we do acronyms in special education, but because those are really, that's like the backbone for creating accessible digital content, experiences, and that they align with the WCAG standards, right? That's another acronym, that we hear a lot. Thinking about accessibility, but how to make it actionable and using an acronym like POUR so we have the information that's perceivable, that's operable, that's understandable, and that's robust. And that kind of helps to bridge that gap, I think, into understanding of, well, what does this actually mean? Because when we're talking about accessibility, we want to talk about who this actually applies to, right? Like when we're talking to teachers, let's say, we might hear something like, well, I'm just a classroom teacher. This is an IT problem, right? Accessibility. But as we've said, we're talking about all kinds of different materials. This is not just the website. This is not just a portal. It's also about instructional materials that are created by teachers. So we're talking handouts, slide decks, things like that. That's really core and central to this update to Title II. So I guess, Janet, kind of talk a little bit about why is this important for the average teacher to care about, and then what can they do in their school to address accessibility?
That's a really good question. I think that as a teacher, right? We know who's in our class this year. But we don't know who's going to be in our class next year. Um, and if you've ever been a teacher that's had a student, let's say you're a regular ed teacher and all of a sudden, a case manager comes and tells you we're going to have a student coming into your classroom who has a severe visual impairment. So now we have to think about all of the materials that you use and whether or not they're accessible. Well, if we were in compliance, then that should not be a very difficult, it is going to be, somewhat of a challenge, but if our materials are accessible to begin with, then it should not be. As a school, as an administration, we need to really take a good close look at the curriculum tools that we're using, and is accessibility built into them? Um, and the curriculum companies, are responsible, and they know that the schools have this requirement. So they're gonna make sure if they wanna sell their curriculum materials, they better be in compliance. So, I think that will help our teachers somewhat, but I also think that teachers need to be aware of this. I think of a classroom that I recently visited in another school district, and I walked in, and this, teacher had the most beautiful PowerPoint
Mhm.
presentation up on the screen, and I remember thinking, "There's a lot of content on that screen. There are all these beautiful backgrounds and swirly colors," and I'm thinking, "I wonder if any of her students have cortical visual impairments." Like, I wonder if they're ever,
Mm.
if they're looking at this information, just trying to disseminate what's a letter and what's a background, and really trying to understand and process the point that you're trying to get across. So I think that we need to remove as many barriers as possible as teachers, and think about, are we prettying up our content too much? Are we giving too much fluff so that we have to process that out? Or are we really just focusing on content, making it engaging and accessible?
And I wanna
Yeah, and
expand. Oh, yeah, you go, Vanessa, go.
well, Janet, what I was gonna say too is that, we know that teachers are juggling a lot, and so
Yes.
thinking about that this is really a whole school issue, and that it's really supposed to be tackled by a cross-disciplinary team.
Yes.
Um, so one of the places that I wanted to point folks to, just in terms of resources, because again, anything that's like this, that is a larger kind of uh, thing to tackle, I always appreciate resources. So in October of 2024, the NCademy organization was founded. So that is the National Center on Accessible Digital Educational Materials and Instruction. So it's ncademy.org is their website. And they have just a ton of resources. They always have webinars and different things like that. But they've actually created an accessibility roadmap for districts to follow. So it's again a starting point to kind of get people thinking. Janet, as you said at the beginning, hopefully people were thinking about this back in April of 2024. But no matter what, this is an ongoing thing. This is not a one and done situation. So we're always looking to improve. And obviously, when we know better, we do better. But this roadmap, what it does, and the reason why I like it a lot, is because it breaks the the steps into tiers. So one of the first things is to establish a cross-disciplinary committee, right? So it's someone from IT and someone from curriculum and someone representing general ed, special ed, the finance people,
Mhm.
obviously the administration of the school. So it's kind of looking at this and saying, this is an everyone issue to think about. How can we do better? And what does each kind of group, bring to the table? And then it goes into more detail, looking at evaluating what you have in terms of accessibility. One of the things we talk about all the time is that just because something is digital doesn't automatically mean it's accessible. So,
Snaps.
Absolutely.
right,
Mhm.
looking at you might have a memo, a document. If it's a locked PDF, the person who has a screen reader, it's going to say graphic. There's no
Mhm.
way to discern the text from it. So, evaluating the big things, like you mentioned, the LMS, the website, but also some of those other pieces of digital content, making sure, that it's accessible. And then that third tier is talking about how are we going to maintain and improve? So looking at from that evaluation, maybe the district does an audit, maybe they do some other type of discernment around what we have and what's accessible to what degree. But then that tier three is talking about sustainability and progress and how can we continue, to move the needle forward. So I definitely would encourage districts when they're thinking about this, and not only in the immediate but ongoing, a resource like Academy can really be beneficial to achieving this goal.
Yeah.
And I think these different resources that we're talking about, this roadmap and the poor acronym, they make this material digestible to different people. And I really like what we were saying about the interdisciplinary team. I love interdisciplinary teams in general, and in all kinds of ways. But yeah, those are some great resources.
Well, and
Yeah, this
maybe oh, go,
this is
Jeanette.
it. Sorry, if I'm thinking from if I was a school administrator or district administrator right now, this would seem like a really overwhelming task. But if you have the right people, it's not a special ed issue. It's not an IT issue. It's an everybody issue because you think about how far reaching our digital materials are in a district. You've got not just your classroom materials, but you've got, your board of ed minutes that are outward facing on your
Mm.
website, and you've got, your faculty login intranets that need to be accessible. It's just very far reaching. So yeah, you need a good team and a
Well, and
roadmap.
And
and I want to expand more on like maybe Jan, Vanessa, anyone can expand why are teachers so important as in choosing the new technologies, and then what do those technologies need to provide to schools? And Vanessa, you kind of hit on it when you were talking about Academy and the different tiers. Like, what is, and without getting into the weeds of it, because I know a lot of people who listen to this aren't really going to be the purchasers, but they may influence the purchasers. So, like, what are we looking at when we're looking at new technologies or anything for a district? What do they need to provide to us? Curriculum, all that kind of stuff.
Sure. Yeah, so this is really, I think, very critical. So as you said, Brian, just to reiterate, so teachers are not necessarily the purchasers in a district, but they absolutely are the influencers. And so when districts are looking at purchasing software, websites, other types of materials, what they want to do is they really want to ask that vendor about their accessibility. One of the things that the vendor could provide is something called a VPAT, get another acronym, a
Oh.
voluntary product accessibility template. And what that does, it's essentially like a document where the vendor can detail how their product is accessible. Like, how does it conform with the WCAG standards? How does it comply with Section 508? It's helping it's helping the district make informed decisions about what they're purchasing, preferably before they purchase it, but also even afterwards. There's nothing to stop a district from going back to a vendor to say, we purchased this. We want to understand a little bit more about your accessibility, and then be able to have a frank conversation. Jenny, you said this before. If it's a vendor and they're selling a product, they clearly want to do the sale. So
Right.
if there's a question about accessibility, there may be some availability for the vendor to go back to their engineering team and maybe make some fixes, maybe make some changes, adapt certain things, right? It's possible. So when the district is looking at those vendors, you want to be asking questions about accessibility, but secondarily, and maybe another step forward, you want to ask them if you could test it out yourself, right? Is there a trial they can give you
Mhm.
for even just a
Mhm.
week, right?
Mhm.
All different. There's many possibilities. Just on a personal note, I always like to say the answer can never be yes to a question that you don't ask. So you can ask them and say, we just want to test this out a little bit. Would we be able to get, a user license that's like a test or something along those lines? Depending on the vendor, they may or they may not. But those are really important things for the district, not only to maintain compliance, but as we said, we want students to have access. That's the most critical thing.
Right.
So asking those accessibility questions of vendors is a way to help ensure and or mitigate that.
Cool.
One of the things that I've heard some districts doing is they take it even a step further. They have asked publishers if they can provide an ACR. And an
Oh,
ACR
yeah.
is an
Mhm.
accessibility
Yep.
compliance report.
Right,
And
right, right,
hopefully
right.
that report is not one that's been done internally, right, by their publisher, kind of
Right.
uh, um, judging
Yeah.
their own accessibility standards, but having a third party come in and, really put their tools, their content to the test and seeing how
100%.
and if their what they're providing, what they're selling, is considered accessible outside of their own standards. So that's something to keep in mind.
You were talking about you just walked into a district, because this is kind of going to move on to what I had another question I had. You walked into a classroom and the presentation was beautiful and had all these beautiful pictures, but as you kind of mentioned, just because it's all beautiful doesn't mean it's accessible for everyone. Someone might have a CVI, cortical visual impairment, and they may not be able to recognize. So, what are some steps educators can take to make their presentations more accessible?
So that's a really good question. Presentations, I think we're years ago it was let's make sure that your presentations are engaging and they're interactive and they're, and
Hmm.
interesting for students. And now I think we're a little bit going in the opposite direction of we have to think about how much visual information your students have to process at once. Like not only what's on your whiteboard, but everything that's on your walls, the information that's on bulletin boards. So I think when we're talking about presentations and we're talking about delivering content to students in a classroom setting, I think we have to think about how text and how images are arranged on a slide, right? Do we have an easy reading order or do we have kind of text thrown in all different angles to make the slide look interesting and fun, if you will? It needs to be easily understandable. It needs to have backgrounds that are solid colors. Not a lot of um, not just gradients, but pictures in the backgrounds, right? Because especially if you think about, are we going to share those slides with a student? And are students going to be using a screen reader or some type of text to speech reader? And there's pictures behind it. Or, you know, and a lot of times we think about, what, this is the perfect picture with words in front of it for our slide. And we use a snipping tool and we snip some text with pictures behind it out of
Mm,
another website and we paste it in. Well, now those words, that text is not going to be selectable. A screen reader
completely.
and the
Yeah.
text to speech tool is not going to be able to read that unless maybe we have, maybe a more expensive tool that we paid for. But, again, visually clear text, clear messages and content is the way to go for students. We have to think about processing issues, visual processing, auditory processing, and how a student is going to receive that information. Um,
And twofold, not only that, what you were just talking about, but if there's more graphics or more noise on the page per se, that makes it harder to make it accessible if you were to try, like say a PDF or something,
Mhm.
to tag all those elements to make sure they're in the same reading order. So not only is it harder, for the more difficult for the student to process that, but it's more difficult to make it accessible if you needed it to be.
Yeah. The other thing we need to think about is if do you have your captions on? You have maybe you have a Google slideshow or maybe you have a PowerPoint on. you have the ability to turn on your captions so that if I'm trying to process what's being said and looking at that slide at the same time, maybe I need to see the text as you're speaking so I can follow along. Maybe I have a hearing impairment and I'm having a really tough time understanding you because I can't read your lips at the same time I'm looking at the screen. So make sure that while your presentations are going, turn on that caption tool so that you have live captions running as you're teaching your class. Make sure your microphone can pick you up. A lot of teachers walk around the classroom and now their microphones can't pick them up. So their captions, their live captions aren't really as accurate as they should be. So it's another thing to think about as you're teaching live.
And that's a wrap on another episode of AT Talks. A huge thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in. We love making this podcast and building this community with all of you. Remember, the conversation doesn't end here. The team at the Assistive Technology Center at TCNJ is dedicated to supporting educators across New Jersey. If you were inspired by today's discussion and want to bring high-quality, free professional development to your district, Vanessa and Madison are ready to help. To learn how you can partner with the center and build capacity in your school, head over to our website. You can find all the information you need at atcenter.tcnj.edu. And while you're there, we want to hear from you. Visit the podcast tab. There you can send us a question through our Google form, or even better, leave us a voice message on SpeakPipe for us to play live on the show. Be sure to follow us on social media to stay up to date on all our latest events and resources. You can find us on Instagram and YouTube with the handle @ATCenterTCNJ. And don't forget to subscribe to AT Talks on whatever platform you're listening on right now so you never miss an episode. On behalf of Vanessa, Madison, and myself, Brian, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
Experts and you.